Galaxy S25 is the latest compact Android flagship phone that Samsung released. It replaces the previous Galaxy S24 Exynos for global users and the S24 Snapdragon for North America and China. Today, I will test not only the battery life, but also the performance and camera of these three phones to see which one is the best choice for you. I am Mo and I bought all three phones with my own money, and I can already tell you that the result will be controversial. The Galaxy S25 runs the latest One UI 7, while both S24s run the latest One UI 6.1. From the back, the only thing that changed on the Galaxy S25, apart from the new colors, is the new camera ring. From the front, we have the same 6.2-inch display. The good news is that if you have a glass from the S24, it will also fit the S25. We have the same M13 8-bit panel again. The phone's PWM is also unchanged from Galaxy S24 to S25, as you can see on the screen. It is 480 Hz. The display is not bad by any means, it is still bright enough under sunlight, and PWM is acceptable and is the same league as iPhone and Pixel. Also, the S25 is now a few grams lighter than the S24, which is amazing, even though I do fear that weight saving can negatively affect the thermals. We will test that soon. Samsung does say they use a larger vapor chamber for cooling. For the first test, I decided to export a 10-minute video using CapCut. All phones are set to the same brightness, using the lux meter and running on the same Wi-Fi network. I'll switch to 5G later. You can see the battery percentage and temperature on the app that I wrote always on the screen. The Galaxy S25 is in the middle, and not surprisingly, it did finish first. It exported the video in only 2 minutes and 24 seconds. The maximum temperature that it reached was 37.8 degrees Celsius, which is 100 Fahrenheit. The Galaxy S24 Snapdragon finished second in 2 minutes and 33 seconds. It reached a slightly higher temperature of 38.3 degrees Celsius, which is also around 101 Fahrenheit. S24 Exynos took its time and finished last in 3 minutes and 22 seconds. It reached a similar temperature as S25, which is 37.7 degrees Celsius and almost 100 Fahrenheit. Over the year, I did notice that Samsung gradually exchanged performance over thermals on the S24 Exynos in updates. Since S24 Snapdragon and S25 finish almost at the same time, we can also compare the power consumption of the two. In this chart, you can see that the S24 Snapdragon in color red and S25 in color blue. The average power consumption of the S24 over time was 15% higher than the S25. This means that, at least in this specific task, the new Snapdragon 8 Elite is around 15% more power efficient and a few seconds faster. I let the phones cool down a bit before running 3D Mark Wildlife Extreme. This test shows the performance of the graphic unit, which is relevant for gaming. Right now, S24 Snapdragon and S25 are at 97%, while S24 Exynos is at 95%. I ran the benchmark on Wi-Fi, and by the end of the test, the S24 Snapdragon got a score of 4,970, the S25 got 6,163, and the S24 Exynos got the lowest score of 4,188. The S25 did get hotter, but we can't judge the thermals yet since the phone was working harder compared to its peers. Before the next test, I went out and did some photography and videography, but I'll show that later in the video. Now, the Galaxy S24 Snapdragon is ahead of the other two. For the next test, I ran Google Meets and I let the phones talk to each other while on 5G. What was interesting was that S25 actually got hotter than both S24 Exynos and Snapdragon, which surprised me a bit. By the end of the test, the S24 Snapdragon was ahead by a few percentage points, followed by S25 and then S24 Exynos. I kept the phones on 5G and ran YouTube on a low resolution so as not to exhaust my data. Again, what surprised me a bit is that the S25 was running hotter than the S24. Since all phones were factory reset at the same time, my only guess is that either Google Play services are not working well with One UI 7, or there are some background services running on One UI 7 that are not on the Galaxy S24 series yet. By the end of this part of the test, the S24 Snapdragon is meaningfully ahead of the other two, and the S25 and S24 Exynos have a similar battery percentage. I followed the test by playing Genshin Impact on mid setting and 30 frames per second. Genshin Impact is a heavy game written by Unity engine. I tried to stay on the same map and do relatively the same task to avoid creating any disparity between the results. By the end of the 15 minutes test, The S24 Snapdragon had 8% more battery than the S25 and S24 Exynos. Also, the S25 Snapdragon used around 10% less power based on the analysis that I have done in this specific test. I then turned off the display and went to sleep. When I woke up, all three phones used almost the same amount of battery and lost around 5%. The next test is the camera battery test. But before moving to the camera battery test, let's compare the cameras. When it comes to the camera, except for the camera rings, which are for aesthetics, we don't see anything new. There is the same 3-camera setup on the camera housing. That would be the main 50-megapixel lens, a 10-megapixel 3x telephoto lens, and a 12-megapixel ultra-wide lens. There is one big software improvement that is going to completely change the way that I use the camera on the S25 series, and that is log. Log is a color profile or gamma curve that lets you shoot a video in a wide dynamic range. The way that it works is that the shades of gray all get the same priority. So when you look at the footage in log, it is very flat. There is no contrast or vividness to it. But suppose you grab this seemingly boring video and do something called color grading in a professional editor like Adobe Premiere or DaVinci Resolve. In this case, you will get footage that is much better than normal footage from a, normal phone. You can color grade your footage so it does not look over sharpened. We still don't know if Samsung will launch this in S24, but there is a chance that they won't. For pictures, I rarely can find any difference between Galaxy S25 and Galaxy S24 Snapdragon, as they are almost identical. You have to actively look for differences. For example, here on the clouds, the colors on Galaxy S24 Snapdragon are warmer than the S25. The big focus on the Galaxy S25 launch event was on the new processing for videos at night and skin tones. Here, I took a video using the Galaxy S25 and Galaxy S24 Snapdragon. And you can see that my skin tone looks very different on the phones. Let me know in the comments which one you prefer. Moving to S24 Exynos and skin tones, I did see subtle improvements. For example, this picture on S25 looks cleaner. On S24 Exynos, I encountered that often the shadows are lifted, which makes the phone look like the lens is smudgy. In general, S25 is less contrasty compared to S24 Exynos, both when it comes to videos and photos, but there is more of a subjective matter and depends on your taste, whether you prefer more contrast or not. Fortunately, Samsung now has a great filter system that allows you to fine-tune and get more or less contrast and saturation on your phone. There is a new default filters that I enjoyed a lot in the past few days. I explained those in more detail in the S25 versus S24 camera comparison, including motion blur and shutter lag. Moving back to the battery test, the next test that I did was to run the camera on 60 frames per second and 4K. The good news is that now you can switch between cameras on 60 frames per second 4K. Previously, on S24 One UI 6, you could not switch when shooting 60 frames per second. I ran the camera to record in 4K and 60 frames per second on Wi-Fi to see which phone is more power efficient. By the end of the test, the S24 Snapdragon was 9% ahead. The S25 stayed a bit cooler than the other two phones. Looking at the power efficiency chart, what is great news is how power efficient S25 is in this test compared to the other two phones. As you can see, the green line here, which belongs to S25, is much lower than the other two. S25 roughly used 15% less power in this test compared to S24 Snapdragon. It is not surprising that because of that, the temperature was also lower on S25 than on both S24s. It was around a degree or two lower by the end of this part of the test. Then, I decided to do the heaviest test of all. I switched back to 5G and ran not only YouTube, but also Google Meets in the background while the phones were connected to each other. This is one of the most difficult tasks that the phone can do because you are not only streaming, but also capturing video, encoding it, sending it over the network, and getting and processing 2 more videos streams in the background. In the middle of the test, I decided to take a look at the charts again to see what the power efficiency looks like. If you look at the power consumption chart, interestingly, this time the S25 used more power compared to S24 Snapdragon, and it is no surprise that the S24 Exynos used the most power. This, to an extent, explains why the S24 Snapdragon has a higher battery percentage so far. It does seem when it comes to YouTube and Google Meets, the One UI 7 is still not as optimized as it could be, or there are some services running in the background. I continued the same test to run the batteries to 0. It seems that Galaxy S24 Exynos is the first one that is going to go. What is interesting is that the Galaxy S24 Snapdragon is not only better in terms of battery percentage, but also has a better thermal. After 3 hours and 40 minutes, the Galaxy S24 Exynos is the first to leave the chat. I know you may think that the screen on time is really low, but please note that I ran one of the heaviest tests that anyone can run on a phone on 5G, and I absolutely abused them. The Galaxy S24 Snapdragon is ahead by a large margin, showing that he's the GOAT. No wonder I picked it as the best compact phone of the year. Also, keep in mind that both S24 are 1 year old and have already run through 10 to 20 cycles. What is also interesting is that the Galaxy S25 is a couple of degrees hotter than the S24 Snapdragon. The next phone that left the chat was the Galaxy S25 at 4 hours and 4 minutes. And that did surprise me as much as it did surprise you. For the record, I did a factory reset on all 3 phones a few days ago, and the batteries are calibrated. The Galaxy S24 Snapdragon is going strong despite being the older one here. At the same time, S24 had 1 year of updates, which could potentially help create a more stable version. The Galaxy S25 continued the test and finally left the chat at 4 hours and 24 minutes, 20 minutes more than S25 and 40 minutes more than S24 Exynos. What I can tell you already is that S24 Snapdragon is still maybe the best compact Samsung phone you can buy, and even with software updates, I would be surprised if S25 Snapdragon does much better. Here is my theory on why the S24 Snapdragon lasted longer. I did notice on One UI 7 beta that S24 Exynos was losing more battery than usual. My theory is that Samsung needs to push a few more updates before we see the true color of S25. When it comes to individual tasks like gaming, videography, and exporting videos, the S25 was more power efficient. But when it comes to applications for Google like Google Meet or YouTube, it used more power than the S24 Snapdragon. This could show potential optimization issues and services running in the background, but only time can tell. I'm going to actually return this S25 that I got from Amazon and get a new one too, just to make sure it is not device relevant. So subscribe so that you do not miss future tests on S25. I have already made another comparison of S24 versus S25, especially when it comes to specs, which you can watch next. Thanks for tuning in to TechMo, and I will see you in the next one.